Can I just remind everybody that this is a public hearing which will be live streamed and recorded. The recordings will be made available to the Bay Plenty Regional Council website following the meeting and archived for a period of 3 years. To those members of the public here today, all care will be taken to maintain your privacy. However, as a visitor in the public gallery, your presence may be recorded. By remaining in the public gallery, it is understood your consent is given if your image is inadvertently broadcast. I also remind all present that local government decision-making affords no protection to councillors, council officers, and the public for communications made during meetings that are subsequently challenged in a court of law and determined to be slanderous. So with that happy note, I call for apologies. I don't think there are any that I've received. No apologies, that's done. Items not on the agenda, there are none. The order of business, just note that we may shift submitters around to accommodate early arrivals, etc. Are there any declarations, commissioners, hearing commissioners, of conflicts of interests? There've been none, that's okay. Just to be clear, when you have the right to question submitters, but questions can only be for clarification only. And submitters, please make sure that you stick to your topic. Before we start, we'll just go through the reports as per the agenda. The first one is 5.1, the hearings. Attachment 1, the public transport plan hearing schedule on the 17th of August. And the second one is the public transport plan schedule for the 19th of August, and then the supporting documents. And there's a resolution, 1 to 3. One, that we receive the report, Regional Public Transport Plan 2022 to 32 hearings. And we receive, and if requested, here's the submissions to the draft Regional Public Transport Plan 2022 to 2032 received after the closing dates. Noting that, and I'm suggesting here that the for late submissions will be accepted only up until 5 p.m. Tuesday, the 16th of August, 2022. So that's passed now, but we did receive a late one yesterday, and we have agreed to receive it. It's not going to be heard. I think there's a copy on your desk.
Chair, do you want a resolution to that?
And I'm just going to read the last resolution. That receives table documents from the submitters during the hearings. So that's 3 resolutions all in one. Would you like to move them?
Happy to move, Chair.
Moved, seconded by Mayor Turner. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Okay, we start off, and the first submitter is Mr. Rodney Milne, and he is zooming in from Rotorua. Is Mr. Milne online? He is. Mr. Milne, welcome. You have.
Well, am I on, mate?
Pardon?
What's happening now?
Yep, they can hear you.
I
and
can
see
see
you.
Where's the speaker?
No, that's the speaker. You don't have to.
We can
Okay.
hear
Yeah, how are you, mate?
you. We can hear you. We can hear you, and you can hear us by all accounts.
Yeah, okay.
You have, sir, you have given a written submission. You have
Yes.
10 minutes maximum, and that includes question time. And I've read your submission, and can I just, you started off with going back over a bit of history, where this is a plan going forward. So please make sure that you stay on forward-looking submissions. We're looking for improvements. Thank you. You may start.
Yeah, where do you want me to start, mate? You want a little bit of my history or not? I was well, I'm going to tell you who I am briefly. I was a company development project manager in Taupo years ago, Northland businessman. I had my own farm for 7 years. I came to town, I started a tractor mowing business, and my family had capos in town. I'm retired now, I'm 83, and I do a lot of tramping. I've tramped the whole area, so I just let you know who I am. And I use the buses now, I don't drive. I didn't have to give up my license, but I want to walk, which I do in a big way. Okay, now, I've got a funny letter from Councillor Thurston. About 7 years ago, we had a focus group, and I won't read it out, but we got onto stuff, and it was basically what you're doing now. And then he disbanded it because there was conflict, I think, between him and the mayor here, and I don't know what happened. It's gone.
Yeah, but
so
let's go.
I gave up. I'm trying to go forward, mate. But what I'm saying is that I had a van for a while. I gave up using the buses, and then I've still got the van, but I don't drive it. Then I want to bring up now that you've got this new ideas, which is good, the routes, but you think in town here, the main stop is not fit for purpose. And I had them on a district council about it when they put it around here. You've got little bloody things that are like dog boxes. And I came today, and you get with the rain's driving in there, they're shocking. So, and they're unsafe. The footpath there is quite wide. There's idiots on bikes come screaming up. You step off the bus, and there's a bike in your face. Just one or two people have been sort of hit there by the bike. You don't see it coming. Skateboards, you name it. Weekends, they're hanging around the bus stops. Young people, 12, 14-year-olds, they won't get up, or I try not to use it on a Sunday. So I'm just letting you know, you've got safety issues. I've spoken to WorkSafe. If something happens to someone getting off the bus, it's going to come back. If it's a court case, it'll come. Now that it's on file, you guys will be responsible as well. And there's another stop up Fenton Street. It's illegal. They cross over. You've got to get this thing in town sorted out, and you've got to put a canopy over out here. I mean, I've done all this stuff in my life. I know how to lay things out, and I can show you without any charge. But it's just ridiculous what you've got over here, and it's got to be a cooperative thing between you guys and the council here. You're always fighting with one another for some reason. I don't know what's going on. So you need a proper stops over here. You need canopy on the footpath. You need to police these idiots on bikes and skateboards and hanging around that park over there in the weekend. There's no security, and they're doing graffiti now. And I've had that in the past, a different thing. I stand up to them, but they don't like me much. But a lot of older people don't want to do it now. They don't want to get on the buses. So I've spoken to Oliver Haycock. It's good to have a guy. He was good. I had a good chat with him and gave him a few ideas. He hasn't been back to me, but he's a guy I could talk to. I don't mind going over there with one or two and say, well, this is what you need here. I know how to lay things out. I did a big farm years ago from nothing. But I know how to do it, and I can tell you how to do it. And I've used the buses. I use the bus a lot. And also the drivers, some of the drivers, most of the drivers are good. I always say present, thank you when I get on. Some of them just grunt or say nothing. Others are very present and talk. And the number 3 that I'm on for Linmore is a tourist one for Long Mile. You need relations with tourists talking. I've tried to help tourists out now and then get off there and this, so that needs to be looked at. The drivers, they've got no seat belts on. If they have a praying in town, they'll fly out of their seat. They won't be able to control the bus. They should have seat belts on. And they're driving one-handed like this. Other hands up here. So not all of them. Most of them are good. I know the guys. Known them for years. Good guys. And they're not safe driving. And the roundabouts in Rotorua here, only 1 or 2 of them do it. They speed up to them and then hit the brakes. Then they speed out again, hit the brakes. And other drivers just use the automatic and come up. They don't gain any time. And they just drive. Seems to be up. The bus will stop, go through here. So I don't know why you can't do these things properly. It's just ridiculous what goes on. I came into the bus today, you know, I mean, I can get out in the rain, but it's wet, it's driving in there. And this issue starting with idiots now. Graffiti on the seats, it's starting now. Old swastikas and different things. And they on that Sunday, they won't get out, they give up for anyone, they're smoking in there, different things. So that, you know, you got to get the stop over here right. You got a nice office there and it's all heated up. It's in here, but what over there? What do old people do? The library's got no veranda. She did all that library up and there's no veranda back to the bus stop. Crazy stuff. People on Zimmers, you know, or a woman with a pram. What are they?
We've got that noted, sir. Have you got any further points? We've got that all, I've written all that down. I've got it all noted. Yeah.
I don't mind meeting one or two over here and showing you what you need to do. You know, I think you treat people doing submissions as second-rate citizens. It seems that way all the time. You've got 10 minutes to do this and that, and that's it. You don't, people with experience in doing things, practically, you don't even come back to them. I complained about the way it was managed it was in one of my submissions here about 6 years ago, about the problems with the buses. No one got back to me.
Well, I'll give you an undertaking, sir, that every submitter will get a written response from this council. How's that? You'll get it in writing. That's my assurance to you. Any hearing I do, all submitters who make the effort to submit will get a response.
Yeah, well, that's good, mate. And I'd like to see it go further. When myself and there was another guy who was on the focus group, a lady that had a Zimmer, about 6 of us were on it, and then he disbanded it. We had all these ideas here 6 or 7 years ago. And I'm willing to meet down here, 3 or 4 of you, Oliver Haycock, and show you what you need here. I've had a go at the lady that designs thing on our district council. Oh, they don't know what you're talking about. You've got to cover that footpath of the veranda so they step out of the bus stops and then onto the bus. They can't stand in the rain. It's, you know, you guys have got the window shut there. Why not have the meeting in the park? Then you... I'm an outdoor guy, mate. Farmer, tramper, contractor, all my life. So, you know, and I've got things I can help you with.
Thank you, sir. I think we'll open it up for questions, just if anybody's got questions or clarification for you. Commissioner Silver, did you ever? You were looking like you were.
Oh no, I don't think it could have been clearer. My only suggestion is that details of the particular stop you're talking about needs to come through as well.
What's it like over there? Raining or not?
I've
just rung my son-in-law in Taranaki, the dog sergeant there. They got a storm down there. Yeah, I just wondered.
Councillor Nees.
Well, thank you, Mr. Milton. We do have a policy that in the plan that covers infrastructure quality. And if you don't mind, I'll just read. It says encourage timely investment in and provision of public transport infrastructure and facilities that, one, ensure a high quality end-to-end journey experience for customers, and 2, give effect to national best practice public transport design guidance. And I won't go on to the rest of it, but do you agree with those as aspirations for our policy?
She took the mail. Oh, you're echoing a lot. Yeah. Okay. You're echoing. I think it's the Zoom thing. Yeah. She is echoing. Yeah.
Well, would you like me to repeat it, or should we just leave it?
What's she saying?
I'll try again.
Would you like to repeat it?
No, well, it doesn't matter. I mean, you said 10 minutes. I mean, I'd like to meet a few of you over here and we should walk around the town and say, this is what you need here for your customers. Then no one's using the buses. Crazy.
Yeah.
There's 2 or 3.
Mr. Mill, thank you very much for your presentation. We will take on board, and I've even written some notes. How's that?
Good on you, mate.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for taking the time. We actually
Good one,
appreciate
mate.
it. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that the finish?
So we now move to submitter 25, which is Kat McMillan. Hi, Kat.
Hi, kia ora koutou. Where would you like me to stand?
Just right, sit on the chair there and just make sure the microphone's on.
Hello? Hello?
No, press the button, make it green.
Hello?
Yep,
Yep.
that's it. You can just sit back, you don't have to get that
Yeah.
close to it. Kat, we allow you 10 minutes, that includes question time. We will have questions to you maybe, but they will only be of clarification, they won't be, we don't get into an argy-bargy at all. All right, so Kat, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So, really, I just want to open with saying that this is like a golden opportunity, I think, to create a legacy public transport system into the future, you know, something that we're establishing now in the light of climate change that our Mokopuna can kind of carry on with into future generations. And I think in order to do that, we're going to require transformational public transport service. I think just the addition of some extra buses and a few extra routes isn't going to cut it. We actually need to shape it for our people's needs. So could I have the next slide, please? So the challenge we have, I see a big challenge facing us right now, is that we've got these beautiful buses and they're not frequented, certainly not enough anyway. I've actually sort of tracked things on social media and just seen some of the comments I've seen just are really kind of alarming / upsetting, you know, things like, oh, me and my husband have a bit of a gamble every day as to whether there's going to be 0 people on the bus when it goes past our house, 1 person, or occasionally there might be 2, ha ha ha. And that sort of rhetoric I see over and over, like the community laughing at the lack of people on our buses. And that's not the community's fault. I think until we shape our public transport service for the people in a people-centric way, then the people are not going to come on to the buses. And that is that they've got to be able to get to where they want to go as quick or possibly even quicker than a car, particularly in sort of rush hour times. So they're always going to choose a vehicle. They've invested in a vehicle, they've purchased it, the insurance, the warrant of fitness, the rego, the vehicle itself. So whether or not it's got petrol in it, they've got that asset sitting in their driveway. And if that's going to get them there in quarter of the time, they're going to choose the car, even though petrol prices are crazy and even though it's damaging our environment. Could I have the next slide, please? So if you look at the green arrows there, obviously you guys know this really, really well, but our responsibility is around safe and resilient communities, and that's where I see this public transport piece coming in. And in order to have a resilient community, we need to be seriously addressing our carbon emissions, because our community can't be resilient without climate action, obviously, and climate resilience as well. But in terms of reducing emissions, we can have huge bang for buck for our future generations if we address our emissions now. So, and it's not going to cut it just by going to EV electric buses if there's nobody in them, right? So yes, we need to decarbonise our fleet over time, but we also need to look at how do we get more people in our buses. Safety, I mean, the gentleman I just heard earlier, you know, it needs to be conducive for all members of the public, people with disabilities, people that are elderly, youth, young people, people with bikes, people with mobility scooters. So we need to have it safe and we need to be addressing climate action. And that's our commitment for our community. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is our vision for 2032, so leading us forward into over the next decade. At a glance, it's just a cartoon, but if we actually stop and feast our eyes on it, we can really see what could transform. This one is focused in, particularly the Western Bay, but I'll touch on the region because we are looking at the whole region as well. I'm only addressing sort of Tauranga and Western Bay because that's where I happen to live. So we're looking at basically a model of rapid transit corridors where people, once they're on those buses, and those are the bigger buses, decarbonising over time, they can move really quickly in bus lanes without sitting in any traffic. But to service those, we're looking at on-demand small shuttle buses through an app like Lift and Go, where it's responsive to the needs of the community. So we're not wasting money on buses going round and round empty, round communities. Tauranga is, an octopus in terms of its estuaries and harbour and waterways. So we need it to be responsive to get around those octopus legs without us paying people's time to be driving around in empty vehicles. They're smaller, they can be brought on as electric from the get-go, and we can get up and running with that without infrastructure costs. They have virtual bus stops, there's no infrastructure there. So feeding into rapid transit corridor with hubs where you can have bike blocks, you can have amenities, safety, lighting 24/7 so that people aren't afraid to be sitting there, seating, protection from weather, and there people can sort of get from the shuttle onto the corridor. We're also looking at the ferry service. So again, no infrastructure initially needed until we get those full as EV electric ferries in place, but little cost to start. Small ferry service going to Omakurawa and from Tauranga to the Mount and back. And then looking at light rail to complement these transit corridors. So procuring land now for park and ride, so that people can get out of their vehicles if they live rurally and access light rail or rapid transit corridors, leaving their vehicles behind and not bringing them into centre, so taking all traffic out of the centre. And then with our light rail connecting to the trains to take us to Hamilton or onto Auckland, and then having regular bus service, affordable to connect us with Whakatane, Rotorua, all around the Bay of Plenty, where people can rely on a frequent bus service to get them around our region. So I can talk to you, I keep touching that. I can talk to you about kind of what comes first or whatever. I'm not a transport expert, but I'm a visionary person, and I believe in strategizing now to set things up in the right way with investing in the right things before we've put in all of our houses and developments, and then it's too late for these corridors to go in. They need to go in first and foremost, even if we don't put the railway tracks there, that we've got these corridors procured and set up so that we don't build houses on them. Also with the park and ride, that we've got that land set aside for park and ride and we're not building on it and then, oh, whoops, we can't do it anymore.
Okay, we probably should stop there and give just some time for questions. Do we have any questions or clarification? Councillor Thomas.
Thank you very much, Kat, and your submission was extremely extensive and extremely interesting. Thank you. In relation to that, your last paragraph says, how do we pay for this? And I just need to understand a little bit more about your suggestion here about the road user charge. Would you be able to just, perhaps just give a bit more detail about the paying for all of this?
Yeah, so some of the infrastructure, as I said, or sort of starting with things that don't require a lot of infrastructure, like the on-demand service and the ferry service, albeit kind of preliminary stages of, and then expanding out into kind of the bigger structure of all of this and the infrastructure. There is a suggestion that there could be a toll charge. I mean, we've got, you know, everything has sort of been established for the port in terms of corridors. And, you know, maybe we need to have a toll so that, you know, freight coming in is actually helping us to set up our cities and our towns and our region in a way that is actually supporting our community to also reduce carbon emissions and be safe and resilient. So I don't have the statistical detail and the analysis of any of the costs. Some of my peers may be able to give you a lot more depth on that, but I see it as stepping things with the initial outlay of things that don't require too much infrastructure, and then actually using our freight, you know, our port services and everything else to be able to get some money to do the things that we need to do. And I also think if we look at a future generations through a future generations lens, we will be paying for these emissions somewhere, whether it's in climate change, you know, adaptation, because we haven't cut our emissions. We actually do need to invest, and I know I don't have the budget here in front of me, and I don't know how much we can invest over the next 10 years, but what I do know is that if we don't cut our emissions and we drive around with a fleet of buses that are empty and everyone's still in their cars, we're going to pay that price in carbon down the track.
Thank you, Kat. That was a worthwhile submission. Well done, you.
Thank you.
All right.
Good day.
We now move on to my long. Is that submission number 33, and that's via Zoom. There you are there. So you've got, is it, do we pronounce it Mai?
May Leong.
May, you have 10 minutes in total, and that will include time for questions. So if you sort of limit yourself to around 8 minutes, the questions will only be as points of clarification. They won't be, there's no cross-examination. So you don't have to worry about that. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity to submit to the plan and also to attend the hearing. So this is all about community transport. A little bit of background. I'm presenting on behalf of the Eastern Bay Accessible Transport Charitable Trust, which is very newly set up. We've only, not long, within a month obtained charitable status, so very new. We're pleased about that. We're going to be known as Waka Eastern Bay, which is less of a mouthful. Now, this was set up under the umbrella of Eastern Bay Villages Te Kokoru Manakitanga, which some of you may know. It's an organisation set up to support seniors within the community. And one thing that was identified as a major barrier for Pākehā is the lack of accessible transport. Once they get older, they may lose their licences. So we did some research into the needs within the community and found that there was actually a lot more need for, that there were transport gaps that affected many more people than just seniors. So I'll very quickly just give you a very brief breakdown of the research we did and what we found. We found that high numbers of people in the Whakatane district do experience transport disadvantage for a number of reasons. They cannot drive, they might have lost their licence, or they can't afford a licence or a vehicle. However, also public transport may be unsuitable. So this could be due to limited frequency and routes of local buses, or the fact that a lot of people in our Whakatane area live rurally or in the smaller towns, and those the public transport doesn't suit. For some, it's to do with their limited physical ability, that they actually need door-to-door transport rather than being able to, jump on from a bus stop. And there's also gaps relating to the interregional gaps for medical related transport, even though St John's and Edgecombe lines do an absolutely marvellous job there, there's still gaps for that medical related travel. So all this impacts on health and well-being, access to social services, community participation, education, employment. So we found a real need. We've identified 4 solutions, which we will work towards through this new charitable trust in 4 stages. The first one is to have an accessible vehicle using volunteer drivers to provide a door-to-door service for people, which is both accessible in terms of affordability and also in terms of disability. However, with one vehicle, which we've already had donated, there's only so much we can do. So we also want to set up a carpooling and rideshare trial too, so that more people can access service than what we can provide with the one vehicle. We also want to fundraise for a van, a community van that can do a rural route as well. And eventually we want to set up a forum of providers, transport providers within the community. That's community transport providers, because there are actually a lot of organisations within the community who provide transport. So it's about collaborating and joining our efforts to make the most impact. So in terms of the submission, we're really pleased to see that there are policies in there which talk about supporting the community service providers. And basically our submission was just to flesh out more details on what's already there. So I'm sure you'll all have have access to the different policies we've commented on with those different details. I'll explain a bit more about the total mobility one, which is policy 2.7. So in order to become a total mobility provider at the moment, the requirements are really substantial, both time-wise and cost-wise. And for community transport providers, these could be quite a barrier to being able to access that total mobility scheme. So it would be great to have more support and resourcing to assist the providers. I'm not quite sure about my time. Have I got time just to give you a quick rundown of some of the examples? I think so.
You've used 5 minutes.
Okay, just very quickly then, you'd have to be SHE qualified, you'd have to have an NZTA small passenger service licence, first aid, P endorsement, 2 NZQA standards, you'd have to have an FPOS machine, and evidence of ongoing driver training and quality management, as well as others which I haven't mentioned. So you can see that those are quite substantial requirements. Yeah, so support with that would be great. And also policy 6.4, we've provided quite a bit more in terms of suggestion of how to flesh out that policy. So again, it's what does support, you might say you want to support community transport providers, but what does that mean? So it's to do with helping with financial grants, helping with setup, all those sort of things. Yeah, so any questions?
Okay, we've got 2 over here. We're going to go with Mayor Turner and then Councillor Thurston.
Thank you, May, for your submission. I'm very grateful that such a strong voice from the Eastern Bay of Plenty, and also the fact that you're doing something quite experimental. And I'll be really interested. I realise it's early stages, and to put too much on you right now is not fair. But I guess I'm interested to see what we can learn off this to provide better general public services that we can leverage off what you're doing, or maybe even better support what you're trying to do. So mine's more of a request than it is a question. I'm really asking that as this progresses, and I know you're in your early stages, you've already identified around the fact you could do with some help around being able to qualify as a total mobility provider. And I'm sure that your district council as well as regional council will be really happy to do what we can in that space. But I guess the other request I'm making is that you note things that are working and not working, so that when we start to look at the more general public transport over the next while, that we can leverage off some of the learnings that you've got. I think that would be really helpful. Thank you.
I don't think there was a question there,
No, sorry.
and it wasn't about clarification, but never mind. Councillor Thurston.
Well, it is election time, Chairman.
No, well, we've got to be aware of it.
I won't. May, thanks for your presentation. It was greatly valued. In all my years in the disability sector, I know that there's a real brains and high need of input in the Whakatane area, and there are some great people who are advocates for the disabled people in your area, so full marks, it's acknowledged nationally. But in terms of our basic transport provision, what exactly is not working for you? Like, we have gold card for seniors, and colleagues in this last term of council have pushed through free fares for profoundly disabled people and their carers. So we feel we've ticked a lot of boxes, but clearly somewhere we're missing something and not meeting all your basic needs. But then I also have a question following on about total mobility. So, but what's basically not working for you in terms of our current provision of public transport services in Whakatane?
So you're absolutely right. There have been some wonderful progress made, especially like you mentioned with the free transport and the fact that you've got kneeling buses and that sort of thing. So I should have acknowledged all that at the beginning. To answer your question, what's not working, probably two main things is one, we're talking, the people that actually can't drive anymore really need door-to-door service. So if they've actually got to get to a bus stop in the first place, that just cuts it out for a lot of them. They're due to their frailty or their disability. The other thing is the fact that we've got a lot of people living rurally, and that the trend, even though there is, say, a bus that goes to Kawerau 4 times a week, it just goes there and comes back. So it doesn't, when people need to get a ride, the time and the route may not suit them to meet the reason for their trip.
So when you talk about the cost of total mobility, you're talking about disabled people, or you're talking about the general population not having access because of their disabilities?
Sorry, the total mobility scheme is only for people with disability. I don't quite understand the question.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is it the cost of total mobility for people that they can't use it within the disability sector?
Yes, so some people say even with
Even
the
their
50% discount, even with that discount, they feel that it's prohibitive, so they might be able to use it, but not as much as they might be able to use it for like real urgent trips and travel. But in terms of being able to get around for the whole of their well-being, which might just be to visit a friend, and yet that can be really important for a person's well-being. They couldn't afford it for all the trips that they need. But for us as a provider, the cost is actually getting set up to become a provider. And then because we're not a taxi out there to make profit, we would be able to make that more affordable for people to access.
And commercial providers like driving the Stacey, are you saying that's prohibitive? And do you have one in the Eastern Bay?
Yes, we do. We have a couple of accessible transport commercial providers.
But there's a cost. It's essentially the cost. Okay.
Yes.
Thanks, Chairman.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, May, for your thoroughness. We will get back to you with once the decisions have been made. I give you that undertaking, and thank you for coming on board. Our next speaker is Dan Kneebone from the Port of Tauranga. Dan, if you'd like to come forward to the middle there and make sure your button is on green. You have 10 minutes, which includes the time for questions, and the questions will be only points of clarification. There's no cross-examination. So welcome, Dan.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity. Look, I'm very conscious of the time constraints on the process and the panel, so I'm happy to be as brief as possible. the port made a submission on the 29th of July and broadly endorsed most of the policies. But I really just want to emphasise two key messages, and they're summarised in my submission. And the first one is that the growth of volume in port traffic the growth in volume of port activity is well publicised, but the point we make is that the increase in volumes through the port does not directly correlate to increased volumes of road transport. And the reason for that is there is an increasing volume of freight on the rail network, and we strongly encourage that. That's the first point. And the second point is transshipment, which has increased massively, particularly since 2015-16, when the port completed its capital dredging campaign and enabled the calling of larger ships, and it was part of the port's hub spoke model. So we're seeing increasing transshipment, and I'm sure you're all aware, that is smaller coastal vessels from other ports in New Zealand dropping containers in Tauranga, which go onto a larger export vessel. So they are the two key reasons that we're not seeing a direct correlation between increase in port volumes and increases in road traffic. And the second point I just really wanted to emphasise was really, we were encouraged to see under the TSP the Hewlett's-Totra sub-area project prioritised. And again, I'm actively involved in that, and I'm aware that an initial business case is underway. And as I was talking to Commissioner Selwood last night, obviously we appreciate things do take time, but we just want to see that accelerated and brought forward as fast as possible, because it's not just an issue for the port; it's an issue for the general public, being able to move around the port environs as well. So your message there is that we're encouraged that project has been prioritised, and we're keen to see it accelerated as fast as possible. And as I mentioned in previous submissions, the port's not simply looking to the city for solutions. There's a lot of initiatives we've got underway as well, including the relatively recent introduction of a vehicle booking system, which encourages deliveries and pickups from the port at non-peak times. So, conscious of the time constraints, just wanted to emphasise those key points, and happy to take questions.
Do we have any questions? Commissioner Selwood.
Thanks, Dan. Notwithstanding your comments about and the really positive steps that have been taken to increase rail mode share and transshipment, nevertheless, the growth of the port will result in significant increase heavy commercial vehicles on the strategic routes into and through Tauranga. And what's your view of well, first of all, what percentage growth do you expect to see, and what's your view of the capacity of the network to handle that?
Yeah, well, something I'm well familiar with, going through the process at the moment for our berth extension is that, moving forward, and when you talk about the container terminal, because we believe that's where the majority of the volume growth is going to be, and historically that's been as high as 7% per annum. Moving forward, we're predicting that volume could be in the order of 5% once things settle down post-COVID. A lot of that volume will be on rail, but I think the important thing is that the growth volume for the container terminal feeds directly onto the state highway network, as distinct from the Mount Maunganui side, which is on the council roads.
And the capacity of the network to cope with that growth?
Yeah, look, in terms of the existing state highway network, that's not a detail I'm across, and we're currently feeding a lot of information through to the consultants that are doing the business case for the Hewlett's-Totra upgrade, and I'm sure that information will inform that decision. So,
Councillor Mees.
Thank you, Dan. You have on the second page of your submission a a comment about the need to keep public transport, walk and cycle trips away from roads immediately serving the port, in particular Total Street and Hull Road. Is that for reasons of congestion or safety?
I think it's just, and I use the example of Totra Street, and I was actively involved in TSP, and it's designated as a primary freight route. And I think, and I forget the exact language that's used, and then they talk about the conflicts when it's also designated as a primary cycle route as well. I think it can't be all things to everyone, and given that it's the connection to the main gate into the port, we'd like to see it prioritised as a major freight route.
Just one other question. It's a bit sideways, but have you been getting any traction at all with Waka Kotahi to accept your proposition that state highways should go to the port entrance?
That hasn't been progressed in the last couple of years. I'm sure you're aware that the port was actively advocating for that. I'm not aware of any progress on it in the last 12 months, 2 years.
It's still something they're seeking?
Yes, we see it as a logical progression, just in terms of it seemed the Hull Road gate into Mount Maunganui is the main entrance into the port, and we think it's logical that there should be a state highway feeding it.
All right, any further questions? There being none. Dan, thank you very much for a nice, concise submission. We will respond to your submission in due course, I am sure.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate the opportunity.
So we now are having a change from the original order, and we're moving to Roland Edwards of the Age Concern Tauranga, submission number 20 on page 51. Roland, if you'd like to come forward.
Hello everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. When the Regional Council contacted our manager at Age Concern to see if we want to be involved, Tanya Smith, our manager, passed that on to me. I am a volunteer at Age Concern, and I have been volunteering for a long time in several roles. So this is another role that I've picked up to speak to this today. First of all, and the chair mentioned about talking about history, so we'll keep away from it as much as we can. Firstly, I'd like to talk about Objective 3, which is a service and infrastructure delivery. Now, we have City Council people here, and I have a comment about bus stops, and there seems to be a lack of enthusiasm of our council to provide bus stops. And I'm talking about Cameron Road, and I appreciate at the time there's difficulties there with all the roadworks. But as an instance, there was a bus stop on the corner of 4th Ave, a new building being put there, so the bus stop had to go. Unfortunately, it went completely, instead of moving it to the next block. So we end up with no bus stop between 6th Ave and 1st Ave. Now that's been a couple of years. I've had an issue with the bus stop that used to be outside Countdown, because I thought that was a valuable site. Several emails over several months, and last month I actually got replied, which made sense. They're now developing bus stops to take 2 buses at one time. So there's more room just north of 12th Avenue. So a bus stop will go there. There will not be a bus stop outside Countdown. When that roading was completed outside Countdown, that's when I started to take emails to council to see why it was not being replaced. The other one that comes to mind is 8th Avenue. There's a motor sales place there, and that roading there has been completed for a couple of months. Still no bus stop. So these are the things that, for older people, we need those bus stops at places along the Cameron Road, and also shelter, as well as seating. Briefly, I'd like to talk about transfer points. And this is not going to be totally popular with old people like me, but I think there's merit in doing that. From 15th Ave to the CBD, and when I talk about the CBD, I like to include the whole of Cameron Road, because in Cameron Road, we've got 2 banks still, 2 supermarkets, we have retail, eateries, etc. So it's a very popular part of the place where, so I think we need plenty of stops there. Between 15th Ave and the CBD, there I'll say 4 buses, the 4 bus routes, 4 buses. From 11th Ave to the city, there's 6 buses. Now, and of course, as we know, not many people on them. So I live in Maitapu, and I do have a 1-hourly service, and please don't take it away, although mostly it's my own service. But we have a cross-town bus that goes through there, and I could change at Old Harry Road, Palmer's Garden Centre. However, it doesn't work out because of the bus times. So if we have transfer points, they need to be in a common place. The bus stops at Welcome Bay are about 400 metres apart. So to have a transfer point, common place, coordinated timetables, and shelter. That could happen opposite Greenwood Park. There's a great big open grassy area which belongs to council, and with a little bit of recontouring, that could become a transfer point, so that from Maitapu I could catch the CT bus there and catch a 40. I'll use the numbers because you might probably know what they are, into the city, which means I would have a half-hour service in Maitapu, and all the people that live there as well. The other one, of course, is Brookfield. There's several buses go through Brookfield, and ideally, if the space was available, building available, that would be an ideal transfer point. So less empty buses going down Cameron Road. I better have a look at the time.
How we don't stop. You've got 4 minutes left, so you're okay.
Oh, good.
Got
Okay.
a couple more minutes.
Okay, that's good. Now, I know our commissioner, I heard on a interview, is not keen on a central hub in the city for buses. And I think this is an ideal. When people go shopping or do their business, they need to have somewhere to go to sit in shelter, comfortable place while they wait for their bus. I know it costs a lot of money, but we're spending millions of dollars on subsidising bus travel, a few more $1 million on an area enclosed. Hamilton have got a bus depot, Christchurch, right in the CBD, huge bus depot where there's cafes and all that sort of thing quite handy. Okay. Now, rail. We have a railway line from Omaka to Chipuki, and in the future, this is not something going to happen tomorrow, but in the future we should be looking at rail. And in looking at rail now, we need to get property for park and ride. If you take Kapamar on the corner of Bell Road, there's big paddocks there. Now's the time to purchase land there for park and ride in the future. The Otomotai railway station platform is still there, although there's no parking. So, thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you, sir. Good presentation, and I'm going to look for questions of clarification. Commissioner Selwood.
Not a question, apologies, Chair, but just some assurance that I've noted down the bus stops that you highlighted, and we will
Thank you.
follow that through internally. And in fact, there is a significant investment program in our long-term plan to accelerate the provision of shelter at bus locations across the city. So it won't be as fast as we'd all like it to be, but it is on program. And in terms of the bus depot, options are not closed on that. We're really in the process of now investigating what is the right outcome for the city. So you'll see some progress on that as well.
Thank you.
Councillor Thompson.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Edwards. That was an excellent submission. Thank you very much indeed. Can I just ask you, in terms of the people that you represent, how much of a barrier is it in terms of grocery shopping and, you know, the need to be able to carry both grocery shopping as well as accessing public transport? Does that come up as an issue for the people you represent?
What I've noticed, when Packensack had the bus stop there, and of course it'll be replaced, people buy small. People don't come out with loads of groceries. They come out with a couple of light bags. So people are planning that, and they may go there 2 or 3 times a week, but because they don't want to handle the big packages. We are one of the providers for total mobility cards. So, and there are hundreds of people, I don't know what the figures are, hundreds of people who take advantage of that. Now, with total mobility, you still have to pay half the price taxi, but people who are able take their bus to town, do their purchasing, and then taxi home. So it's a combined feature with that. We have a good bus service.
Thank you for saying that, sir, because I think we do too. You know, we're certainly going in the city. There's a lot going on in the reconstruction.
Yes.
And if we just can look past that a couple of years, I think you'll see huge improvements. So hats off to the commissioners for getting on and getting the central city actually revitalised. Any more questions? That's my political statement for the day. There be none more. Thank you very much, Mr. Edwards. Appreciate you coming in. Our next submitter is coming in from Australia. He is Ian McDougall and Liftago.
Hi, everyone. Yes, as you said, I'm calling in from Australia. So before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the Awabakal and Warramai people, who are the traditional custodians of the land where I live and work, and extend my respects to all Aboriginal and other First Nations people who might be on this call. So yes, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. I did supply a document as part of the submission. I guess our main interest is around how to augment and drive more public transport usage anywhere that we have operations, and I think there's some really strong potential to leverage the existing bus network that you have in Tauranga and elsewhere, and really use some of these emerging technologies and practices to drive mode shift and get the most out of your infrastructure that you've already put in place. So I've just prepared a small little slide deck for you. I don't seem to have control. Should I share my screen and take control? Would that be?
Yes, please.
Just let me.
So while you're doing that, are you related to the McDougalls in Tauranga?
I don't believe so, but the name goes back about 1,000 years, so somewhere along the line, so I may well be related to them. Yeah, I'm Canadian and Australian stock, so unlikely to be. We are everywhere though. Yeah, so I guess thanks for the opportunity to present. Just briefly, bit of background on who Lift Tango is. So we provide technology and design services around shared mobility. So that's often in the case of on-demand services, sometimes carpool as is carried out in Tauranga at the moment through the Wednesday Challenge. So we're based in Australia originally, but we are global. As you can see from the map, we have operations pretty much everywhere. And from that, we've learnt quite a bit around how on-demand transport can really benefit communities. So just briefly, if you're not aware of what demand responsive on-demand transport is, essentially it's a more flexible version of public transport. It is still public transport, but generally speaking, smaller vehicles are able to cover a broader geographical area to extend the reach of the public transport network, and they respond to where and when people want to actually travel. So rather than having to conform to a fixed route, the system will actually essentially operate similar to a combined taxi service, allow people to get to various places around the area. So I guess the potential impact as we see it in Bay of Plenty, I've specifically focused on Tauranga, but this can be applied elsewhere. Really, it's to augment the current network, and that's where we've seen a lot of success elsewhere. There's been lots of iterations of on-demand transport. Where we've seen the biggest impact is where it works in with the existing or future bus network. I think what it can really do in that case is drive patronage onto those trunk routes. Seeing you've made mention of that in your planning documentation. Where it's often successful is feeding people in as a local collector, delivering them to mobility hubs for onward journeys. So often that's rail or trunk bus routes. And it does also offer the opportunity to provide journeys for people that wouldn't otherwise be possible on the fixed route network. Because as you well know, the fixed route network, you have to make some compromise in how you design it. And the on-demand system offers a way to, I guess, bridge some of those gaps by offering journeys that aren't possible on that fixed route. One of the really nice things we see as an aside or as a result of this type of service is the ability for people to connect with their community elsewhere, particularly among elderly users. So some of the services we've been involved in, elderly people can't access a bus stop. It's just not physically possible for them to do that. This type of service is implemented and that gets people into the community, out of their house. We've actually seen cases where people have reconnected with old friends and people they know that they haven't actually been able to interact with because of their mobility limitations. One really exciting area, I think, where this type of concept can work, and I note that around Tauranga there is lots of new growth plans, particularly in the extremities. The challenge that public transport always has is keeping up with that growth. It's very hard to introduce infrastructure and justify fixed route buses where there are no people yet or only a few people. Where we've seen a lot of success is delivering on-demand transport services into some new growth areas so that when people move into those areas, there is an immediate public transport option. That's the time when people are making their behaviour change. They're much more likely to respond to what is there in terms of service, and in fact will research that service availability before they move. So that's something we've seen as a quite exciting use of on-demand transport. Another sort of aspect of on-demand transport is the ability to serve multiple user types because of the flexible nature of it. It can flex through the day and serve different people at different times for different purposes. So just as a few examples I've pulled out, for commuters at the peak commuting time, it offers a way of, I guess, getting more direct access to employment. So if the start and end of the journey are not on a fixed route, then the on-demand service can provide that direct access. It can also provide the linkages into those trunk routes as well, and offers a much more convenient, I guess, pickup opportunity for them. One thing that we're well aware of here in Australia and elsewhere as well is First Nations people often have transport as a major barrier for a lot of things. Access to healthcare, access to social opportunities, cultural sites and various things that either a lack of public transport or the design of public transport prevents them from engaging with. And that's where we've seen, particularly in a place called Moree in Australia, on-demand transport was taken up extremely well by the Aboriginal population there, because it provided access to things that they could not access with the existing public transport network. I've touched on elderly people before as well. What we've seen is normally a network will be designed with a bus stop within about 400 metres or 500 metres of most people. That's fine for a lot of people, but noting what the gentleman from Age Concern was speaking about before, people with mobility issues will struggle to make that 400 metres. So an on-demand flexible service that can actually get to people's door and respond to those requests where and when they're needed provides a much more equitable way of public transport offering service to a broader sector of the community. Noting the figure on the right is just the age of the population of the area, and as I'm sure you know much better than me, there is a high elderly population in that area. Tourists, again, it is something that's potentially of interest, but really I think where the general impact or opportunity for on-demand is the ability to design it so that it flexes to meet people at peak demand time, people off-peak demand time, and offering various ways of people to get around the community based on their needs. The reason we've focused on Mount Maunganui and Papamoa Beach is I think there's an immediate opportunity to solve some problems and deliver some of the mode shift that you guys are looking for. The figure on the right, one thing that we often look at when we're profiling areas is the comparison between public transport journey time and car journey time. And you can see in that figure, red is bad. Some of the journey times is up to 5 and 6 times as long on public transport as it would be in a car. And that's a very important decision-making impact on people on whether or not they use public transport network. So, you know, we've engaged with various people around the area and received some quite interesting and positive feedback and support for the idea. I think something that it offers for Bay of Plenty is the opportunity to test this concept and potentially build a blueprint for rolling out this type of transport in other areas throughout your jurisdiction. Some of the new growth areas that I mentioned before, but also some of the more regional areas where it's harder to provide good quality coverage and network benefit for people in the lower, more rural areas and lower density population centres. And that's again where on-demand transport can provide a real benefit.
Mr. McDougall, you're at about a minute and a half to go. We do want to have time for questions. How are we going on your end?
Okay, I'm just going to fly through the Auckland Transport site. It's in reference site. It's in southern Auckland. It's designed to feed the rail network. It's I think 4 or 5 vehicles. They're all electric vehicles, and they move flexibly around that zone. You can see there. What they did was remove one of their routes, the yellow route you might be able to see, and implement on-demand over the top of that. What that essentially did was expand the population, the coverage that the public transport network had in that area by 38%. So you're bringing in a whole new level of potential public transport users. What's really interesting, I think, is that most of the users who use this on-demand service did not use public transport before. More than half of the trips that are made on this on-demand transport cannot be made comfortably on the fixed route public transport in that area. Surveying the users, they said 67% of the trips that were made on this service would have been done by car if on-demand was not available. So that's a pretty strong argument for mode shift in this area. And finally, I guess the really exciting thing is ridership is actually up in this area above what it was prior to COVID, which is a pretty astonishing outcome. And that's on the basis of the flexibility and convenience of this service. So I think I'll stop there. I might just leave that up as a summary, but yeah.
Thank you for your submission. The question I have for you is, last Friday we had a visit from Hawke's Bay Regional Council, and they've only just started in June, but with huge uptake. Initially, instead of going on demand in the peripheral of their bus service, they've actually gone on demand off peak. So they have peak morning and night with the big buses, and then they go on demand with a 12-seater through the middle of the day. And it's very early days because it only started in June, but they've had a very big uplift in total patronage as a result of that. Have you experienced that sort of on-demand system? It's the first I've heard of it, and we're concerned Timaru is trial service, but it's very expensive, and so we're just looking for other options. Have you experienced that on demand in busy city routes?
Yeah, no, it's really good. I mean, what that highlights is that there's a lot of different ways you can leverage this type of solution, and the key to doing it well is to understand the local area and what is working and what could be improved. The biggest challenge that transport networks have generally is infrastructure for peak versus infrastructure and service for off-peak. Generally, you need to buy the vehicles to carry the maximum amount of people at the peak time, and then it's just wasted space. So we have seen similar successes elsewhere, notably in the UK, where at those peak times, the key journeys are getting into work or getting to the train station, and the volume of people moving at those times justifies fixed route buses and larger vehicles. But there is huge peaks, which means huge troughs, which means you end up with buses running around empty for no purpose during the middle of the day. The frequency of service tends to blow out to hourly or 2 hourly, which doesn't actually end up suiting many of the people. The people who move during the day move differently for different purposes. It's more to access services rather than to access workplaces generally, and more, I guess, social functions as well. So that type of movement lends itself to a more flexible off-peak on-demand service. So I'm very glad to see it. Sorry, say again.
Moving on, we've got a couple of questions from, first of all, Councillor Nees, then Councillor Thurston.
Thank you, Mr. McDougall. We have been keen to investigate on-demand services for a couple of years, but it's been quite difficult because of our public transport operating model, which has been changed, so that gives a bit more flexibility. Also been quite frustrated about the fact that we've been limited to having big buses. So it's very interesting to see what you're offering. For a service over an area like Mount Maunganui and Papamoa Beach, how many vehicles do you think you would have to be running, and would they be a mix of different vehicle types?
Yeah, it's a very good question. There's a lot of inputs that will determine the types, number and sizes of vehicles required. Conceptually, if you have a service that's as flexible as possible, it can go from anywhere to anywhere. That generally requires more vehicles than if it's more constrained, sort of picking particular hubs or locations you can travel to or from, and that's because the vehicles can end up going basically anywhere. An area that size, you would generally, don't hold me to it, but you would generally need somewhere between sort of 3 and 5 vehicles to provide a decent level of service. bearing things in mind like wait times for vehicles, length of time on the vehicle for people who have booked, and I guess promoting the sharing capacity and not just ending up with buses that act as taxis doing 1 hour trips. But that's the sort of thing that's important to really work through in the design phase and understand what those vehicle requirements are, but also thinking about resourcing. So there's often vehicles in the community that are underused or not used at all at particular times during the day, and whether you can leverage some of those assets in the community as part of the solution design.
Councillor Thurston.
Ian, thanks for your presentation. I think it was exciting and I think it was timely. As you may or may not be aware, we're going through an election cycle at the moment, but would you be available to do a more in-depth presentation to a committee, be it either our public transport committee or our regional transport committee? How do you handle this? I don't know if you have a New Zealand office or a New Zealand resident here that acts on your behalf or represents your interests, but how would you like to explore this a little bit more? Because I think, I speak for my colleagues, there's a degree of excitement about what you're proposing.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. The overriding answer is yes, absolutely. I'll be there with bells on. In terms of getting there, we've had clients in New Zealand for the last 2 years who we didn't actually get to meet until 3 weeks ago when we finally managed to cross the border. And I would happily come back pretty much at any time. So yeah, thank you for that feedback, and happy to work towards a face-to-face meeting of some sort in the future.
Just a quick supplementary, Chairman. In terms of other regional councils in New Zealand, can you elaborate a little bit more who you're working with? Clearly Auckland Council, but are there other regional councils that you're working with?
I probably am not in a position to elaborate, just based on.
I'll respect that. That's okay. I respect that.
Thank you for your time, Mr. McDougall, and for presenting to us today. We now move on. Okay. We now move on to John Robson, submitted number 63. If you'd like to come forward and sit in the middle, make sure your green buttons are going. I didn't recognise you with all that hair, John.
It's a protest. I refuse to cut my hair until we get democracy back in Taiwan.
Welcome, John. You have 10 minutes in total, so suggest you speak for something like 8 minutes and look for a couple of minutes for questions.
Thank you. It's nice to see all of you again. I think I've seen you all at least a few times over the past few years. Let's get into it. Let's start by being nice. Thank you for the 10-minute allowance. I think it's helpful to have time to sort of outline one's position on things and have time, of course, to answer questions. Yesterday we had 5 minutes in front of, some of us had 5 minutes in front of the Select Committee looking at Three Waters over in Hamilton. It's a bit light for a topic that big, and public transport, of course, is a big topic. I've assumed you've all read the submission. I just want to develop some of those points a bit more, perhaps with examples, and a lot of it came from the submitters this morning was sort of interesting, and gave examples that I'll use to illustrate the points I've made. Really concerned about the plan. Obviously, I read all the background documents and the documents that sit around this draft public transport plan. My biggest concern really was no financials. It's really hard when you're making submissions to evaluate what the relative cost of things is, and therefore what one thinks from one's own perspective, political, ideological, whatever, identity group, intersectional analysis. You can describe me however you feel comfortable, but that perspective needs to be informed. And the trouble is with your draft public transport plan, it fell well short of the sort of content that I would like to have seen. to enable me to make an informed response. So, I mean, if you haven't got a plan that actually has clearly defined actions with associated costs and some associated timetables, we're really flying in the dark. We're a bit like Kobe's helicopter pilot, and it didn't end well for Kobe, and it won't end well for us. Numbers are really, really important. And if you don't set that example, you run the risk of submitters turning up and doing exactly what you do, which is put down a list of ideals or aspirations or things that are very, to use a phrase, mum and apple pie, and therefore difficult to disagree with, but actually doesn't provide you with any insight as the sort of trade-offs you need to make as an organization. It's really important. That whole economic opportunity cost thing is critical for the work that you do, and critical for the work, for instance, that your partners, Tauranga City Council, do. And just as an aside, it would be really good to see a better working relationship between Regional Council and Tauranga City Council. There's evidence of conflict, particularly in the public transport place, in the public domain. It's not been made an issue of, and I don't think it should be, but it does need to be addressed. When I came back into council in 2018, I identified at the first Smart Growth meeting I attended a conflict between the plans of Regional Council in terms of what they were hoping in terms of operation and what Tauranga City Council was intending in terms of infrastructure. Yet both of you regarded it as a joint plan, but it was clearly two silos operating very much independently of each other, and that really does need to be addressed. And I think Councillor Nees made comment in this meeting around the operating model and the changes proposed by central government. And I think some of those changes are extraordinarily valuable, but they still will require a degree of, how can I put it, genuine collaboration between Regional Council and the TA, and I've still yet to see evidence that that's happening. So point one, without numbers, very, very hard. Actually, without numbers, it's not a plan. It's simply a wish list and unhelpful. And in relation to Lift Tango, it would be really good to see the numbers on that. But let's talk about a different set of numbers, not financials. Let's talk about the linkage of your targets, for instance, MOCHA aspirations, and the thing that Regional Council declared a few years back now are a climate change, a climate emergency. I'm concerned that I don't see evidence in what you're doing of an integration of these things that are important to you. And that's really disturbing. And I mean, even more disturbing is I was reassured on Friday at a group of people who are very passionate in the environmental space. I was reassured by some Regional Council staff that Oricon are working on exactly what the status of, if you like, Tauranga is, the Western Bay is, Bay of Plenty is with regard to greenhouse gases and emissions and whatever else. It's absolutely shocking that you're working on it. It's 2022, folks. You declared a climate change emergency a long time ago. According to our Prime Minister, it's the nuclear issue of our time, the nuclear weapons issue of our time. How long does it take to get data, really? And again, without that data, how can the public judge how well you're doing? You don't actually produce, as far as I can see, having gone through a documentation, a clear report on your progress around issues. It's very hard when one looks at the work by TAs and Regional Councils, other areas in local government and central government for that matter, to link up proposals to outcomes and actually see what's delivered when. You actually use different formats between your reports and your plans. But at least your plans, in terms of annual plans and long-term plans, at least they do have some numbers and some timings in some parts of it. This draft public transport plan has none of that. It's a list, as I say, of aspirations. Difficult to argue with them. But mobility as a service, mobility on demand, what's it going to cost? We need to know that before we can start getting all excited. At some point, that has to be part of the discussion, and it's simply not. So a request for finances, a request for integration, as I say, mode share and emissions targets. Because looking at the numbers, and I'm someone who made a submission to the Climate Change Commission, I don't think that what you're proposing in terms of mode share for your public transport aspirations is really what's required to meet what I think it is your aspirations are around emissions and climate. You know, and if you don't join that stuff up, you're kidding yourself. You're absolutely kidding yourself. And if you're serious about it, you've got to join it up. In the same way, you've got to join up your infrastructure and your buses. And, you know, that's been a topic for years now. The third point, and it's another set of numbers, and it's not just about numbers, it's by forcing the KPIs in, by putting the numbers in terms of outcomes, you focus on what it is you're trying to deliver. And this is not about, you know, there's a Tauranga City Council has recently been doing some work on vision and stuff, and they've come up with this phrase, and I think it's patronising, I think it's total BS, but walking backwards into the future. And anyone who's actually conversant with conventional and current thinking around strategic planning knows you walk forwards to today from the future you want, but you have to be able to connect the future you want to where you are today. And by having genuine performance measures, it forces that focus. And at the moment, I don't see that focus. I see lots of aspirations. There was a meeting last night with 150 odd city leaders. But even the documentation that was used at Tauranga City Council on Monday to approve the content that was being celebrated, it's so flawed. The pictures don't even line up with the words. As a matter of fact, the pictures don't even line up with the graphics in the document, let alone the words. It's really important that we get performance measures that are driven by outcomes that reflect the aspirations of our community. So where am I with your draft public transport plan? There's a lot of good stuff in there that in terms of aspiration and direction, I support, I would encourage. You know, disability thing, as Kirsten knows, I have a personal interest in that place. I'm still yet to see you provide disability parking for the van we use for my son, because you don't understand what a disability vehicle requires in terms of parking width. So I've still got disability parks all over town I can't use. The point I'm getting at is it's not about the numbers, but the numbers are critical in terms of giving focus, judging your success, and making sure that your outcomes, if you like, remain, you know, in line with what it is you're talking to your community about.
We're at 9 minutes, just so you know.
And so I'm done.
You're done. Look, thank you for that. I'll just open it up and say just a couple of comments. One, that we are working closely with Tauranga City and Public Transport. We've got a joined up committee just with 2 commissioners and 2 councillors trying to get exactly what you're talking about. And
it's the emails between the chief executive, sir, that they're circulating, they're in the public domain, and they show there's no join up between Tauranga City Council and Regional Council.
Let me just say that it is, I think we are starting to break ground with it. It's a slow process, but we are. With regards to your questions on numbers, I'm like you, I like numbers. I've been assured by staff that the actual financials happen in the long-term plan, and this plan has to work within the constraints of a long-term plan. So that was there, just so you know. But I'm like you, I like if hard KPIs. When I came back on council in 2016, the KPI for public transport that it wouldn't be more than twice as slow as a car, and I found that outrageous. And but anyway, I have asked staff to add, you know, some numbers to the likes of the rating page, the funding page, so that it's not just percentages. But I did read several of the other regional councils along public transport plans, and they're similar to ours as far as I understand. Question, we've got Councillor Thompson.
Yeah, no, thanks, John. Good, really good submission. Thank you. Can I ask you a question? And that is, how would you go about costing the failure to actually address the carbon emissions, particularly in terms of the targets that the government is both setting and will set? How would you go about costing that?
When we talked about numbers, they're not just cost numbers, just to make that point. We have people skilled in econometrics, so we can start to look at things like, we've already done it in some cases. We're looking at the impact, for instance, of emissions in terms of deaths, human deaths. We can look at the impact of not hitting our emissions in terms of what the impact of climate change will be, in terms of therefore how much increase, for instance, the sea level rise we might get, or adverse events such as we're experiencing all over the world in different ways, shapes and forms. We can put costs for those. We've got people talking at the moment, Tony in Wellington, you won't be able to insure a house in 10 years' time because the cost of insuring $1 million property will be $100,000 a year. There are ways and means of modelling and introducing then costs to produce financial numbers to indicate the impacts of doing or not doing things. This is pretty much standard operating procedure in the large corporates that I used to consult for. That sort of modelling is not unusual. So it depends on the particular topic. The critical thing that I see at the moment is you don't collect the data you need to fit them, to build the models. And we've seen that with regard to TSP, for instance. You were so short of data, and you're still short of data. And just as a quick aside, just reminding me of something, thinking about the TSP, in terms of conflicts and integrating things, the point made by Dan Kneebone, who I don't think was presenting here about public transport, he seemed to be presenting about something else completely different. He came to the wrong meeting. But he did remind me, the idea of having conflicts between designating a route as a freight route and a cycle route is just nuts. And by the way, if you bring forward what you're doing with Hull, Tocha and Hewlett's, you further destroy the already inane business case that underpinned the stupid spending of $8 million on that space, because it requires to be in existence for 20 years to hit its return figures.
Were you looking for a question, Councillor First?
No, I was going to address John and say, well done, brilliant presentation. But in terms of wrong meeting, John, the dimensions and number of accessible car parks is an issue for TCC. That's outside this meeting, as you know. So, yeah. Okay, but no doubt Commissioner Selwood's picked up on it and we'll fix it tomorrow. So.
John, our time is up. Thank you for your presentation. We will get back to you on it, as we always do. Is Mary Dillon in the room? I can't see. Oh, she's hiding behind the chair. Mary, would you like to come and give your... We are due to have a cup of coffee, but I just think we should... No, let's keep moving. Because there's only two more, and if Commissioner Torrey turns up, we'll do hers as well. And that will save us having to break for coffee.
Well, it's not that I'm too short. Your chairs are...
No, it wasn't. Was that big chair? I couldn't see it.
Chairs are too tall. That's definitely what it is.
Welcome, Mary.
Thank you.
I don't have to tell you how to handle this.
Briefly, I'll be handing it to you, Koto, sorry. Just to say thanks for the opportunity to present to you today. And I get fairly bored by statistics, but I did come across some that I thought might be quite interesting to share with you before we start the discussion on the actual transport strategy or public transport strategy itself. And that's some stuff that was done by Ipsos Global Advisor. And I noticed with great interest that one of the things that comes out in that most clearly is that the people in the world, the nation in the world that are the most concerned about climate change is actually New Zealand. But the second thing that's really interesting in it is we have a very strong view that the things that will help climate change the most in New Zealand is actually by managing our waste a bit better and by growing our own vegetables. And we do not regard eating less meat or driving our car less often as being important in relation to what we need to do to address climate change. And that view is held much more by men than it is for women. So good on the ladies. But I thought that was an interesting place to start, because I think my big comment about this strategy, and I'll be quite brief about it, is that it totally kind of lacks any urgency or passion. And I think that really, really worries me. You know, the fact that it's always an incremental approach. But I think if you compare the language and the approach in it, for instance, with what Wednesday's challenge will submit to you, the difference is quite stark. that sense of urgency that we have to move on transport, on public transport is very important. And I think that takes me back to that stat, because those stats are about perceptions. And one of the things that perception is there, and you can see how waste has actually picked up on that perception and played it to their advantage, particularly in Tauranga City, who got some excellent coverage on the national radio yesterday about their waste strategy and their food and their bins of what have you, and well deserved. But the interesting thing is that until you change perceptions, it's very difficult to make a headway on the place you really want to change the needle. So maybe before we actually, deal with the strategy and the investment in it, we need to do some quite hard work, as for instance, TCC in Hamilton City, and a number of councils did. They spent a long time managing that end of the perceptual spectrum before they actually moved on the actions. So just something that for your attention, because I think at the end of the day, perception is everything. It shouldn't be, because logic should be, but it isn't. Perception and emotion trump it every time. So that's my main comment to you today, is to think about that, and to say that whilst I appreciate all the actions that are in the plan, and I'm not too worried about whether they're costed or not at this stage, because I make the comment to you that the days of trade-off, transport and the environment, are over. The environment cannot give any more than it's given already, and climate change is the most clear example of what that actually means. So the days of trade-off, saying we can put a lot of money into building a bigger and a better road with all the resources that go into not only the cars on the road, but the actual emissions that go into building the road itself, which is something like twice the emissions from the cars. I think those days are, finished. So we need to rethink where we're at. Public transport is part of that very important process, but I think we should deal with the perceptual side of it. And I think the plan needs to have a much more passionate, connected vision. And I think it needs to imbue to the community a sense of urgency about what it's actually all about. That way it will be a successful strategy. So that's all I've got to say.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mary. I did try to read your submission, but it was in such small print. I had to use a damn magnifying glass, and it's quite hard to read when you're doing it with a magnifying glass. So that's a hint. Oh, that's your version. My version is just
Mine is absolutely fine.
No, that's our stuff.
Would you like my copy?
I did read it, but it wasn't easy. And before I ask the questions, because we're still waiting for Anne to turn up, I think it comes in the sheet behind someone. You talked about waste and how well, I saw on the news how well Tauranga City's doing. I live in an apartment block of 8. Most of them are older than me. And we used to have 8 food bins every week. And funnily enough, we still put a food bin out every week. But there's only 2 go out nowadays. So, and
I think, Andrew, that's a direct result of COVID. And I was just talking about Sam Fellows in relation to that today, about what COVID's done. But I also think that, and again, it's about perception. People actually think when they put stuff down the incinerator that that's the end of it. Almost no citizens realise what that does to the sludge and sewage systems, and how incredibly expensive it is actually to get rid of the sludge at the end of it. You're talking about millions. And I think, again, that's that perception thing. That piece of information actually hasn't carried out. A lot of people in my street are exactly the same. They've gone back to using your incinerators because all those houses have got incinerators. I've got one. I never use it. I couldn't get the builder to take it out. But that's what's happened. And I think we need to do quite a bit of work in that area, which is completely off subject. But
yeah, that's okay. Questions of clarification? Councillor Lee.
Yes, I've got one question, and I've been trying to find it, but you have a comment after how much do you agree with proposed objective, and then you talk about point 7 as an inevitability in some form. That's about charging, and that will happen inevitably. I think the legislation is going through, it's gone through. that absolutely has to happen. I think there's a lot more consensus in the community about congestion charging, but the comment about the port is because the port itself puts massive pressure on our roads, and those port costs should lie in the right place. The port in the end is not the city.
And then Turner.
Thank you. Just quickly as a question, do you have any recommended reading or resources around how you start to massage public perception, I guess is the way I'd put it? We know we all need to get greater buy-in on a number of matters that have environmental implications. I think that's what would be. Do you have any resources you recommend that we would consider? Because I think you're completely right. It's one of the biggies.
I think you can look to Wednesday Challenge for a start. Some of the stuff they've done, but that's directly about transport. If you're talking about what I was talking about, moving the perception of importance, then maybe you should look at the sort of work that was done in relation to waste and think about that in terms of transport, and see if there's some lessons there, and how you can actually go about that, and make sure you use more resources than council. There are people in the community who can, and I'm not talking about EnviroHub, but I know we use Miriam Makamo, for instance, for a short video on waste. That made a huge impact. And it costs nothing to put.
Do we have to put our waste on the public transport? Is that how we get? Is that how we get this discussion relevant to this?
That'll be trains, wouldn't it?
Any further questions? Because I think we've got off topic. Thank you very much, Mary. Commissioner Toddy, we would love to hear from you. We're due to break from afternoon tea, but if you're the last one, we'll move people forward. And,
there's always a danger of getting between you.
No. Well, we're not worried about the tea now, because if we can get it finished and start earlier, because Stephen's got a flight to catch, you see.
Right.
You have 10 minutes, and I suggest you speak for about 8, and maximum of 8, allowing a couple of minutes for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to come and talk to the Tauranga City Council Commission. Kia ora tato, everyone. So I think, in fairness, our submission was quite brief, but I think that reflects that a lot of work, a lot of collaboration has happened between TCC and the Regional Council during the development of the plan, and I think that needs to be recognised and that needs to be celebrated. And I think we're all working very hard to ensure that that continues and increases as we have that public transport joint committee. There's three matters I want to address today. Well, actually, there's 4. There's 3 that are in the submission, and one that's a personal one that I just want to re-emphasise. And the first is around the challenges. Now, in your draft plan, you're identifying a number of the challenges that I think we're all on board with, like the geography, the growth in traffic, and the safety and security, both of passengers and of our drivers, etc. However, the major challenge that we all face is one of funding, and we all have high aspirations. The government has high aspirations, particularly if we have a 20% reduction to meet in vehicle kilometres travelled, and that's going to cost. There's no doubt about it, and so I think we think that should be highlighted as one of the major challenges that we face, and recognise that there are many work streams underway in order to confirm funding, but the reality is that most of them are complex, they are lengthy, they are highly competitive. Any money that's put on the table is quickly gobbled up from other councils around the country, and so there's no certainty for us if we want to put together a significant plan to lift the level of both the level of public transport and the level of patronage of public transport. So we think that that should be identified as one of the challenges. The second one's pretty minor, but it's just making sure, we had a conversation earlier today in smart growth, so just making sure that all the targets and the objectives that we have at a sub-regional and regional level are all interlocked. So whatever objectives you put in this plan, they have to be consistent with things like UFT and the TSP, and that just makes it. That means that everyone's on the same page then, and would also help if then some of the sources of those targets are referenced, so that everyone understands where we've got those figures from and what we're working to. Thirdly, monitoring and review of the plan, and we've had a number of discussions over the last 18 months about the use of data and what data is available, how that's being reported and how that's being used. And that's going to become increasingly important for us. So that framework that is put together to monitor and review the plan is absolutely critical. And on behalf of TCC, we're very keen to work together with the Regional Council to develop that draft monitoring framework. And you know, when you come to something like looking to reduce carbon, that data is absolutely critical, because if we continue to have buses that run around with only 1 or 2 people in them, we're actually increasing carbon emissions rather than reducing it, and that's not our objective. So can't underline enough that absolute use of good data that gives us a really good picture. So that's the 3 points that we wanted to make from the submission. From a personal point of view, on behalf of the commissioners, we think it's really important. I know the language is in the plan, but it's absolutely critical if we are to increase the use of public transport by our communities, that the service that's provided is based on the needs and wants of the users, rather than developing, you know, an efficient and an effective public transport system. We need one that meets the needs of the people that we want to use it. And I know that other councils are having a look at on-demand services. It's not quite so easy for us with our geography here in Tauranga, but it has to be a service that people want to and are able to get good access to, that they want to use. And I didn't hear all of Mary's, but you know, something like the Wednesday Challenge, that is a public education program. We are going to have to think about that as well. And how do we get people to understand the need, or just think about using an alternative mode of transport. So that's really the points that I wanted to make, Mr. Chairman, but I've got Alistair here to answer any of the difficult technical questions. But thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay, Councillor Neves.
Thank you very much, Anne. We've had submissions from people wanting us to be much more ambitious with our carbon emissions reduction targets, and of course we now have a emission reduction plan coming through from the government, and I'm very conscious of the fact that many of the documents that have already got targets in, for example UFT, were developed before that there were more, you know, the more stringent requirements to make emission reductions. So we can't do both. We can't stick to the old targets and have them mirroring them, as well as delivering what the community is wanting, which is a much more ambitious program to reduce our transport emissions. So what would be your suggestion, where we've got historical documents that perhaps time has moved on from, that have got targets that perhaps may not fit where we might like to go in the future?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that the TSP, I hope we haven't moved on from it, because we're just starting to implement it. So we've got to be very careful. But I think you'll find that the TSP is already working on this. They are already identifying the carbon use and reduction and measuring that against, you know, doing the gap analysis, if we like. So I have, Alistair can confirm it, but I think that work's quite well advanced.
If I may, yeah, that work and the focus on emissions is quite advanced, and we are picking up on that at a detailed level through the business case development, particularly those key corridor projects. As we prepare for the next round of LTP development and NLTP development, obviously it'll be a key driver of the reset of the program, not a full reset, but a realignment to, change policy, emissions reduction being one of those things. And to help support that, we've been developing an emissions projection tool. So we're able to sort of use that information up front this time to help drive program definition.
So the regional council's got some funding for a transport emission reduction plan. So are our staff working closely with the TSP staff to align the work that's been done?
Yes, so your staff are part of the TSP project team and right through to governance, and we have had initial conversations with those at regional council that are more sort of environmental emissions focused on the tool that we've developed.
Thank you. Any further questions? Councillor Thompson.
Yeah, thank you, Alistair. And if I just can pursue that TSP emissions analysis work, I'm presuming that also has regard that will analyse the emissions coming from infrastructure, both present and intended.
No, it is limited at the moment in terms of vehicle kilometres travelled. So that might have to be an additional piece of analysis that comes through actual project delivery, because I guess it's at that project delivery we understand the sort of, embedded emissions from that construction. The TSP is based on kilometres travelled and the associated population growth.
Thanks for that, Alistair. If I just might add a little bit to that, Jane and I were at a meeting, I think, with Minister Shaw last week. And I might have got this slightly wrong, Jane, but my understanding of what he said was that generally speaking, the carbon emissions from infrastructure is as important, if not more so, than from actual vehicular emissions. So I just presume that going forward, we will have regard to the need to do that analysis as well.
Yeah, certainly. So the guidance is still coming from government in terms of how we should, as best practice, apply that through business case development, but certainly embedded and operational emissions from projects is something that we're right across and trying to scope.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Okay. Any further questions? There being none, thank you very much for your time. We will get back to you when our first submitter this afternoon said that we never get back to people, but we always do. And you can be sure you will hear from us. So thank you, Commissioner. And thank you for the public. We will adjourn the hearing.